Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with my follow-up to last week's video, which I think will be a little bit longer because I actually want to talk about these books slightly more in depth. And this video is the top 5 books I haven't talked about enough this year. I talk about books as I read them, plus I do my top 5 videos on a weekly basis so I can talk about books I've read in the past. But there always seem to be books that slip through the cracks, books that I love or really enjoy that deserve to be talked about more, but somehow they always get left out. So I figured I'd go through the top 5 of those, from this year at least, and talk about some books that deserve more than they get. The first book is A Season of Daring Greatly by Emerson White. If you remember from my last top 5 video, or really any video where I talk about one of my favorite series, The President's Daughter, this is by that same author. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why this book is on this list. It's because whenever I talk about Emerson White, I loved her President's Daughter series, so that's what I go to immediately. And this book I really enjoyed, just not quite as much, so it's hard when I'm choosing between the two because I don't want to put 2 books by the same author on a list. This is a YA novel, although it does kind of reach a little bit into new adult, because most of the book takes place after the main character Jill has graduated from high school. Jill is a baseball player, she's a pitcher, and she's very, very good. Good enough that she gets drafted by the MLB. She becomes the first woman to be drafted by a Major League Baseball team. And she doesn't go straight to the majors. I think this is a very realistic look at what it's like to be a baseball player who gets drafted right out of high school. She starts in the minors, but there's a lot of media attention on her because she's the first woman. She gets a lot of hate, but she also gets a lot of weird support that kind of makes her uncomfortable because she doesn't want to be, a hero for all women. She just kind of wants to play baseball. She kind of resents that she's been forced into this role, but at the same time, she also understands her importance to the game. And I was very hesitant about this book. I read it because I love Emerson White, but I don't gravitate towards sports books, although I do like baseball. This book was really well done, though. I don't know why I doubted Emerson White, because she's amazing. Her writing is amazing, and her characters are wonderfully complex. I do think you have to enjoy baseball at least a little bit to like this book, because it's very heavy on the baseball. Through this, you can really tell that the author is a big baseball fan, which is fun if you also enjoy baseball. But I think it'd be a really rough read if you don't, which is disappointing because it's such a great book, and I do feel like that limits its audience quite a bit. This book has a very meandering plot, which I kind of like. It doesn't have a single arc like most books do. It's more of a character study on what it's like to be Jill in this situation. And I really enjoyed that because I found in the few books of hers that I've read, I found that she does that a lot. She likes to focus on the character and their growth in an extraordinary situation rather than focusing on a specific plot or story arc, which I think could turn off a number of people that are very plot-driven. But if you are character-driven and you like baseball and you don't mind a very meandering plot, I highly recommend this book. I know that's a very specific subset of people, but this book is wonderful. I've only talked about it once, and that was when I read it about 1.5 years ago, and that was only in a vlog. I never did a full review. And at some point, I'd really like to do a full review on this book to do it justice, because it really does deserve that, and I haven't done this book justice. The next book on this list is The Virgin Suicides by Eugenides. This is a very well-known book. I think most people are aware of it, either for the book itself or for the movie. I've both read the book and watched the movie, and I really, really love the book. It tells the story of a family of 4 girls, I believe, 4 or 5 girls, who at some point or other all tried to kill themselves. It's a very odd book because I feel like that description doesn't actually describe what the book is about. The reason I really love this book is for the narration. It's the only book I've ever read that's written in the first person plural. It's told from the point of view of the boys in the neighborhood, and they never use the word I within the narration. It's always we. We think this. We do this. We did this together. And whenever they're talking about a specific boy, it turns into the third person. Like, we watch Brian jump over the fence. Brian is then excluded from the group since he's doing something individually. And I think that's a style that can go very wrong. I've read certain things online by people who write in that style, who, do experimental things, but I thought Jeffrey Eugenides did it beautifully. It made that book really a work of art to me. And I know the reason I don't talk about this book is because I haven't read it in a very long time. I originally read this book back in high school, and I adored it then, and I adored his other book, Middlesex, which I've talked about a little bit more on this channel. But because I haven't read it in so long, I feel that it's kind of unfair for me to bring up this book and say, oh, this book is amazing, I really love this book. I haven't read it in almost a decade, but it's one of my favorites. I feel like I need to reread it, and I need it to be more fresh in my mind, to be able to really talk about it in depth, because otherwise I'm talking based on what I remember instead of my experience of the book itself. But I read a number of classics in literary fiction when I was in high school because I was that pretentious kid who thought that they needed to read all the classics in lit fic. But honestly, out of all of them, I think Jeffrey Eugenides was the one I connected with the most. I thought his books were so well done and so interesting. They always pulled me in, and I had a hard time putting them down. And I want to read him again as an adult because my tastes have changed a lot since I was about 16, and I don't want to bring things into this channel that I haven't experienced in so long, because it seems like I might reread them in another year and think, oh no, I hate this book and I've been talking about it on my channel for the past year like I absolutely loved it. But I do want to reread The Virgin Suicides really soon so that I can talk about it if it continues to be my favorite like I think it will. The next book on my list is Story of a Girl by Sara Zarr. Sara Zarr is a fairly well-known young adult contemporary writer. She's written a number of things recently. I know she wrote Sweethearts and Roomies. I think Roomies, that she wrote with Tara Altebrando, was her most famous work. I haven't been keeping up with her super recently, so she might have come out with something new since then. But I believe Story of a Girl was her debut novel, and I loved it. This is the story of Diana, who's a 17-year-old girl about to graduate from high school. She grew up in a very poor part of town, and she has the awareness that she's not going to leave this town. She's not going to go to college. She's going to stay here for the rest of her life, and she's kind of made her peace with that. When she was 13, her father caught her having sex with a 17-year-old boy in the back of his car. And ever since then, things have changed for her. The way her family looks at her and treats her, the way she's treated at school. She's seen as the school slut, even though she was a 13-year-old child with a guy 4 years older than her. And this book kind of delves not only into how people treat her and how that's affected her, but how the whole situation has affected her. And it's really interesting. I read it a couple of times, not super recently, but it was always one that was a favorite in high school that I returned to. But I always feel like this is one I have trouble picking up for my top 5 lists, because while it has a lot of great qualities, it doesn't have anything that's uniquely special about it that makes it a favorite. It's just one of those books that is a favorite. But if I'm looking for a YA contemporary, this isn't the first one I grab. If I'm looking for a book about slut shaming, this isn't the first one I grab. If I'm looking for a book about small town America, this isn't the first one I grab. It feels like it's always second or third on that list. And that's not to say that I don't love it, because I do. It's just second or third on a lot of lists where other books are first on maybe one. But this is a fairly underrated book. I don't see many people talking about it, and I really think it's such a worthwhile read if you like issue-driven contemporary books. That's always been a genre that really appealed to me, and of the issue-driven YA contemporaries, this is a really great one. The next book on my list is one I actually have talked about a couple of times, and that is The Unseen World by Liz Moore. This is a recent literary fiction novel that I think came out in 2017, or possibly 2016. It's set in the 80s, and it tells the story of a young girl whose father is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. He works for a university studying computer science. He has a lab that he runs. He's very well known within the industry. But when he starts to lose himself, Ada, his daughter, starts finding out all these different things about him. But because by this point his memory is so far gone, she can't just ask him. She can't confront him with all these things that she's learned because he doesn't have the answers anymore. So the book follows her over the course of a great many years as she tries to discover who her father really was. It's such a beautiful book, and I have talked about it. I read it earlier this year. I read it this spring, and it was one of my favorites of the year. And considering it was one of my favorites of the year, I think it's really disappointing that I've only mentioned it 2 or 3 times. I'm literally rereading it right now via audiobook because it was so good. I want to experience it again, and I didn't have time to pick up a physical copy of the book. It's so wonderfully written, and the characters are so complex and interesting. And the story is a mystery, but it's not a thriller type mystery. It's just this girl who's trying to discover more about her father after she's lost him. And it's so heartbreaking. It made me cry several times throughout the book. I really feel like this is a book that I should have talked about more this year. I should have done a full review, although I wasn't active on my channel at the time that I read this book. It deserved so much more attention from me just because of how much I adored it. I've recommended it individually to several people, and I've actually bought copies for people, but I don't talk about it very much, and I feel like I need to spread the word about how good this book is, because I think it's one of those books that a lot of people have heard of and a lot of people have read, but I don't know, I just feel like not enough people have read it. Until everyone has read it, not enough people have read it. That's kind of my mindset on this book. It was that good. And it's one of those books that I feel like a lot of people would like. It had some small elements of sci-fi. It's a historical fiction, but it's historical fiction in the way that even if you don't read or enjoy historical fiction, it's recent enough that you can kind of just almost disregard that part of the story. But if you do enjoy historical fiction, it's got a lot of elements of the 80s that you can really appreciate. It's got complex characters and an interesting plot, and it's just such a well-rounded, amazing book. I can't sing its praises enough. I can't describe how wonderful that book was, and I really wish I'd talked about it more this year because I think it deserved to be talked about. The final book on this list is also one I've mentioned this year, but I think only once, and that is Love Affair by Leslie Kenton. This is a memoir, which makes it the only nonfiction book on this list, but it's one of my favorite books of all time. This tells the story of how Leslie, as a young girl, was sexually assaulted and raped by her father repeatedly. It delves into the complexities of their relationship and how he was her father and she loved him. He was her father. He did a great many wonderful things for her. He raised her. He loved her. But he was also her rapist, and she does talk about these things very frankly. And she says that she loves him, but she also says that she hated him, and how much he harmed her, both physically and psychologically throughout her life. Her father, Stan Kenton, was very well known for his jazz music, and she talks about that. She talks about his fame and how that impacted her life and the people that she knew because of him, and how the view of him in the world was very different than the view she had of him and the view her mother had of him. And it's a wonderfully important story, I think. I was very hesitant going into this book because it is called Love Affair, a memoir of a forbidden father-daughter union, and I was very worried it was going to take too positive a spin on this situation, but it really doesn't, and I feel it's kind of an unfortunate title and whatever this line is called, subtitle, because she does talk about her father in many different lights, and she talks about him positively and negatively, but she never shies away from the facts, and she never shies away from the word rape, which I really appreciate, because a lot of people, when it comes to things like this and rape, they shy away from the actual descriptive words and try to be more vague about it, and she doesn't. She talks very specifically about the harm he caused her and the psychological issues she had later in her life because of it. And I related to a lot of things in this book, and it was really important to me and really emotional for me to read. And I haven't heard anyone else talk about this ever. It was one of those books I just picked up randomly, but I thought the writing in it was beautiful. I thought it was absolutely well done, and I do think it's an important book. I don't think it's one that's necessary to read to sort of understand this kind of situation, and it's definitely a very difficult one because she's very descriptive and graphic, and it's really hard to read about some of the things that happened to her. But at the same time, I think if you're interested in any kind of book like this, if you're interested in learning more about what it's like to experience something like that, especially a nonfiction account of it, I think this is a wonderful book to pick up, and I highly, highly recommend it. I think I put it on my list of favorite books of all time just because it was so wonderful and so good, and this was probably one of the most surprising books I've ever read. I was very worried it would be a hate read just based on the title alone. but if it sounds like something that might be up your alley, I can't recommend this enough. And it's one that I really want to talk about more because it's not been too long since I read it, only about 2 or 3 years. It is so lovely, but it's also so difficult. Because it's nonfiction, that makes it a little more difficult to bring in when I read mostly fiction. And because it's about such a difficult subject, I don't always want to sort of be a downer, I guess, because this is a very dark, touchy subject, and not everyone wants to hear it, and I don't always want to talk about it. I'd rather talk about not necessarily happier books, but at least fictional accounts of things like this. It's really hard to get so excited about a book when it's about a woman who was raped in her childhood, but it's one of my favorites, so I do want to try to talk about it more and bring it up and maybe convince some other people to pick it up. Let me know down below if you guys have any books like this that you absolutely love but have a hard time bringing up on your channel for whatever reason, if it's just because you forget to or if there are always other books that get in the way, because I have a lot of books that almost make it onto top 5 lists but never quite do, and I feel like it's kind of disappointing not to bring those books in and talk about them some more. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys again soon.